Welcome to Curious City, the podcast from Glasgow Life Museums. I'm David Scott, and this is how it works. In each episode, we head out into Glasgow, making connections and discovering the stories that surround us. This week, we've the first of two themed episodes. Today, we're all about light. We'll be looking at electric light, sunlight, candlelight, and finding out what light is. In our next episode, by way of contrast, we're having an in-depth look at darkness. But back to today. To help us step into the light, we welcome Scottish history fanatic April Hamilton. April's perhaps best known for her 60-second Scottish histories on TikTok. April, welcome.
Hi there, thank you for having me.
April, for first-time listeners, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, so I am a teacher by day, so I work with children with additional needs, and by night, I suppose, I really enjoy delving into Scottish history, primarily on TikTok. And it's just something that's always interested me, and it's something that I enjoy sharing with the world. My own personal knowledge really starts about the 1500s. Upwards, I really enjoy sort of World War II history. However, through doing this channel and people ask me about things, I've been doing my own research, so I think I'm getting a bit more knowledgeable about all the areas of Scottish history, but in particular my own interests are sort of the 1500s and upwards.
You say this is a lifelong passion. What started it off?
Honestly, my mum taking me to museums. So I'm from Paisley, so we would go to the Paisley Museum, but also up to Kelvingrove. I loved going to the Old Transport Museum. Even when I was a teenager, I used to go on dates to the Transport Museum because I'm just that kind of person. So probably my parents fostering the love of history in me. I also had a very good history teacher in high school who really then deepened my knowledge of finding out about history. But it's just something that I think is really fascinating, and you can apply it even to modern day contexts.
So you're somebody who likes a museum, April?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think there's so many different museums, and I think especially where we live, the west of Scotland and Glasgow, there's so many different types of museums depending on what you're interested in. You know, you've got the Riverside Museum if you're interested in your transport, obviously the Kelvingrove Museum and Art Gallery has got fantastic paintings. I think there's just really something for everyone. I quite like your sort of living history museums where you can pretend that you're there and that you are living in that moment. And I think there's so many museums on our doorstep to visit and enjoy and learn from, but also I take my 3-year-old little girl, you know, she doesn't have as much of an understanding as to what the artefacts are and what their significance is, but she just really enjoys, you know, running about looking at dinosaur skeletons and, you know, the pretty pictures and getting to dress up as a princess and things. So I think that museums they're really important, but also they're just somewhere for people to go. And the fact that they're all free as well, you know, even just if you don't have anything to do, it's a rainy day, you want to get out of the rain for half an hour, you know, you're never really too far from a museum you can step into and just have a wee look about. Okay,
so back to today. Our themed episode today is all about light. What is light? This was the question we asked ourselves, as you do, when we were prepping for this episode. To help us find out, I was at Burrell earlier in the week with one of our conservators, David Thompson, to find out what light actually is and what this means for our collections. What better place to start in our episode about light than finding out about light itself? We were at Burrell again this morning, and I'm joined by David Thompson. David, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do for the museum service?
Yeah, David Thompson's my name. I'm in the conservation department at the museum. My job is preventive conservation, which is the holistic care of the entire collection. The way we look after our collections is by having them in buildings, such as the Burrell. The Burrell is one of my favourite buildings, and of course a lot of light comes through the windows at the Burrell, and I think that's what we're going to be talking about today.
That's exactly what we're here to talk about today. David, what is light?
Light is energy, and the source of that energy is the sun. So the light takes 8 minutes to get here from the sun, and when it arrives here, it warms up our lives and illuminates the landscape that we live in.
What challenges does light set you in your job here at the museum?
Light is quite an interesting one. We know that light causes damage to most of our objects, so of course we store them in the dark, but we have to also exhibit our objects, and we have to exhibit them carefully, knowing that light is actually causing damage to them. We all know that light causes damage. We know that fabrics in our house can get faded by light. Well, the same happens to museum objects. So this sets us an interesting challenge in the museum. we're supposed to keep things, our job is to keep things for future generations, but also we need to display them so that people can see them. So the very act of putting these light-sensitive objects on display is causing change, is causing damage to them. But by understanding which objects are light-sensitive, we can actually come up with a strategy to manage that, to manage them for future generations. And the notion is we've come up with is a kind of moral argument. We've decided that, or most museums have decided that it's acceptable to have one just noticeable fade for each generation. So with that understanding, we actually display our collections for a limited number of months in a year, and then they go into dark storage. Dark storage really slows down the changes. And we can have a kind of a notion of like a bank account. The object has a certain amount of money associated with it, the money actually being light hours. We try and use those up so that audiences visiting the museum can enjoy the collections now, but also we're keeping them for the future.
What types of objects are the most sensitive to light? What ones require the most care?
Well, some of the most light-sensitive objects that we've got are the ones that contain pigments used in pigmentation in watercolour paintings and in dyes and fabric. Those are probably the most light-sensitive items in the collection. And also some of the most beautiful objects are constructed using dyes and pigments. The Crawhall watercolour collection in the Burrell, one of my favourites, and it's very popular, but we can't have it on display all the time, so we have to kind of ration it. And we can create events, where we're displaying them for 2 months only, and that keeps public interest in them. People are able to see them, but also they spend a lot of time in dark storage.
And what about on the opposite side of the spectrum? What are the most robust types of objects?
Objects that are made of stone or ceramic. And if you were to visit the Burrell collection, you will see that we've used the daylight areas of the museum to exhibit those. And if you come into the internal parts of the building, that's where you'll begin to see some of the more light-sensitive objects. As I say, we've got this dilemma. Displaying the objects is what we must do, but the very act of displaying them can cause changes and fading.
David, thank you. You've got us looking at light in a whole new way this morning.
My pleasure.
Light as energy. I'd really not thought about it like that. It's amazing. Every time we speak to one of our colleagues, we uncover something new. April, it could be said, it should be said, your TikTok channel's helping people discover something new. Can you talk a little bit about the platform, what it is, and why that's the platform that you choose to use?
Sure. So I think like a lot of people who use TikTok, it was actually lockdown that introduced me to the app. That's kind of when the app gained in popularity. At the time I was teaching, but I was stuck in the house. I had a newborn baby, and I felt like my brain was going a little bit to mush. And I thought, what's something that I know? And so I started off with sort of west of Scotland Paisley history, things like the witch trials. And it wasn't even really to get an audience, it was just to put it out there. And then slowly my channel started growing. So TikTok's a really good platform if you've got a short attention span, if you want quick information. It is a vast platform. Really, you can learn about anything. It's obviously a social media platform, so you get that sort of thing. But it knows what you like, so the more you watch of a certain thing, the more it will show you. So if you enjoy Scottish history or history in general, the more videos you watch about that, the more it will then show you. So it's quite adaptive that way. I focus on doing the short snippets, 60 seconds, mainly because I'm not really an expert on anything. I'm kind of a jack of all trades, master of none. So this was a really good medium for me. I don't think I could have done YouTube videos that are hours long because I just don't have that knowledge myself to go in depth about these things. I'm primarily quite popular with Americans. A lot of them really enjoy learning about their Scottish ancestry and the history of Scotland. It's a very, very wide age range, from your younger teenagers all the way up to, retired people. I actually got someone message me saying that the information that I'd given on TikTok helped them write their history essay for school, which was amazing to hear. Lots of people give me ideas for things they want to learn more about, so they'll comment on a video saying, have you talked about this, have you talked about that? And that really helps me, because I did get to a point where I thought, I've talked about everything I know. I can't possibly talk about anything else, but there's always something else. What interests me is the people and the lived history of things. So if it's a castle, I don't tend to talk about it was made from this stone when it was built, and then this bit was blah. I'll say which family lived here, if there were any interesting events that happened there. And then if people are interested in that, they can go back and look themselves. But I find that's a better hook. People are interested in people and their stories. They don't really care so much if something's made of sandstone or limestone. I mean, you'll get people who do, but the regular everyday person wants to know about regular everyday people. Making history more accessible, instead of, some people might see it as quite stuffy, which they couldn't be further from the truth, but I try to make it as easily accessible for everybody. And I just really enjoy the interactiveness of it too, the fact that people can ask me about things. I'm not such a big creator that I don't see the comments.
Do you see many museums on TikTok?
It's an area that I think is not as utilised as it could be. They don't have as much of a following as I think they could have, and I think that it's an underused platform. A lot of places don't seem to utilise it as much as they could. Even getting people like me to come and talk about something and just doing it as our own video, but then you can use it as your video.
What does TikTok do that other platforms and other channels can't?
It's a platform where you can get information out very quickly, especially if you sort of provide a hook within the first few sentences. Primarily, TikTok is a 60-second and less medium. It's also a very good platform for the younger generation. So if you're trying to get the younger generation interested in things, this is the app they're using. They're still on YouTube, they're still on Instagram and things, but really they're on TikTok. And so if you want to get the younger generation interested in things or to show them things, that's really the app you need to be on.
Okay, our next feature today takes us back to Burrow to look at a very specific form of light. It's a cliche perhaps, but we all absolutely take artificial light for granted. And it's very easy to forget that thousands of objects at Burrow were made without the use of electric or even gas lighting. Let's find out more from Becky and Michael.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Quinton, and my curatorial remit is the European Dress and Textile Collection.
Becky, you spoke in one of the films at the Burrow Collection about the importance of good natural light needed by lace makers. Could you expand a bit more on that?
Yes, this was in particular for needle lace. So that is lace that's made with a continuous thread and a needle, and you're doing stitches. The stitches are tiny. I mean, you can probably get 2 per millimetre. They're tiny, so you really do need to have good eyesight for this. The trouble is that with these workshops, in the 17th century, they just don't keep the records of the workers. So we have no idea, in fact, were these girls who started off young and actually had to retire soon because their eyesight went, and while you could get glasses, the lace makers don't get the wages to be able to afford glasses. So was it that it was a job that you could only do for a certain number of years and then you'd have to go on and find different work afterwards? With other types of lace, particularly the ones that you develop further north, such as bobbin lace, because that's worked with lots of multiple different threads, tighter bobbins, that is one that you probably can get away with having lower light levels. When you see the paintings of 17th century lace makers, quite often they haven't got windows in the background. They are sat indoors.
Becky, just what would it be like to work with little or no natural light?
I suspect it'll be really tricky with textiles, and certainly if you're an amateur in the evening, you find nowadays people will go out and buy daylight bulbs. But for a lot of the items in the collection, they were made by professionals, so they're working during the day, so they would have made, first of all, best use of natural daylight. And when we're coming to Italian 17th century Venetian lace, they're in Italy, they're in Venice, the light is much better. So we're not in a dark Glasgow grey day. They would have started off with a much better natural light.
How would makers use natural light and artificial light differently?
So professional makers will generally try and use natural light. Here with the needle lace, we're talking about white on white, so you don't need to worry about colours. But the stitches are tiny. You need to have good eyesight. You need bright, clear light to do it. As soon as you get into artificial light in the past, the candles, oil lamps, the colour change, it's called colour temperature, that will change and everything is probably going to go slightly more yellow. So with white, you're not going to get the colour change, but it might make it harder to do those tiny stitches. And if you're doing colours when you're wanting to match one thread with the next thread, that could cause problems. You could end up with something that looks fine under artificial light, but as soon as you put it under natural light, the colours aren't quite matching, or they're jarring a little bit more because you've gone for the wrong shade of blue next to the red or something.
Becky, how would makers use candlelight?
If you were wealthy, there were ways of boosting the lights. But obviously, if you're a lace maker, you don't always have that wealth. So we don't know whether you had access to that, or certainly when it comes to France and you get the big lace works being set up under Louis XIV in terms of trying to create businesses to keep the money in France. If they're set up on that big business level, are they then investing in putting in better artificial light? So there are candles, and you could get different qualities of light depending on the type of wax being used for the candles, the tallow, the beeswax. Like many things, the better quality was more expensive. There were other things that you could do, but again, this is requiring money. You could have put candles in front of mirrors. So certainly you get this, when you think of Louis XIV and Versailles, you get the fantastic windows, but between the windows you'll get pier glasses, huge mirrors. And the idea is that they become your evening mirrors because you'll put your candelabra in front of the mirror and it will double the light coming out of it. But again, that's expensive. So are you going to get those in the 17th century? For the professional needleworkers. By the 19th century, you will get a lot more amateurs, women doing needlework, lace, embroidery as a hobby in the middle classes. They've got the money to have the leisure time. They've got the money to be making nice little bits, either plain sewing for charity or nice kind of things that they could make as gifts to sell in charity bazaars. And if they've got that little bit of disposable income, they probably could have invested in better quality candles. And you start to get things where you've got maybe a glass bowl that you could put water in, that you could stand in front of your light, and that could magnify. You're then beginning to get better oil lamps where the light is being magnified through having the chimney and then the great big glass bowls that you get with oil lamps, and then eventually we'll get gas and electric lighting.
It's really interesting, Becky, to hear more about making techniques and the light involved in them. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Always so interesting to hear from Becky there. April, is costume or making something that you're interested in?
It is. I've got a kind of heightened sense of I can do anything. So I thought I could make things. And if you follow the steps, anybody could, I suppose. But I love clothing. I love expressing myself through clothing. Primarily, if you were to see me, I'm either dressed sort of 40s, 50s, 60s or like 90s grunge. There is no in between. I think that expressing yourself through clothing is really important, and it's something people have always done. I think people think back to 1700s, 1800s that women in particular had to dress a certain way, and they did, but they had ways of expressing themselves through that, and the cultural divides between clothing, what women of lower classes had to wear compared to the things that women of the upper classes could wear. As I mentioned, I hired a gown from that's not an original 1700s gown, but it was reconstructed, and I hired that for the week, and I just pranced about Scotland in it. I went to castles and walked about, and it was amazing the feeling it gave me just putting on just a dress. Doing up the corset and feeling genuinely like how the women felt, going up stone staircases, going, this would have been quite tricky actually in a big gown like this.
Okay, back to today. We're about to meet another one of our colleagues for whom controlling light is a large part of their job.
Just bring it in here. This the Province Lordship stuff?
That's the one.
Okay. Are we doing the Alistair Gray sculpture today as well?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Jim, thanks for talking to us today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
My name's Jim Dunn. I'm a photographer with Glasgow Museums, and I've been working here for 41 years.
Where are we this afternoon?
We're in one of the two studios that we have in Glasgow Museum's Resource Centre. Pretty much every object that comes into the collection or already is in the collection should be photographed at some point. It's documenting the object, very often several different shots of it, different views of the same object, but also maker's marks or sculptor's marks, artist signatures and things like that. They're all documented as well.
Over 1 million objects in the collection. I'm sure you've photographed hundreds of thousands of those. What are the challenges you're facing in a studio environment when you could be photographing, well, anything?
The most difficult difficult challenges are actually to do with reflection on objects. We find a way of eliminating light and reflections from an object, and then we add in the light and the reflections that we want. If you have a completely flat lighting system on something, then there's no shadows, there's no way sometimes to actually tell the shape of the object, so we then introduce brighter spots on it, softer shadows, but still shadows to allow for definition of the object as well. Transparent objects like glass and things like that can be difficult. If you get a chandelier coming in, for instance, 200-300-year-old chandelier, it's got thousands of facets on it, and actually lighting something like that can be incredibly complicated and a real head scratcher sometimes.
I would have thought it would have been the size of the objects, but it's light itself that poses the biggest set of challenges.
Light itself is the biggest problem for us. The size of the object's almost irrelevant. We've had a 4-poster bed, a medieval 4-poster bed in recently. It's a big piece of furniture, it's a big piece of oak. And it's a relatively straightforward thing to photograph, but interestingly, really dark objects, especially dark wood objects, absorb a lot of the light, so controlling the light and the reflection, the highlights and the shadows is the biggest part of our job.
Other than the pure documentary stuff of the object, what other types of photography might you be performing?
We do fine art photography of painting, especially oil paintings. We do UV photography. UV is ultraviolet light, which allows you to photograph paintings, oil paintings, and see what's below the immediate surface. Sometimes you can see the painting beneath the painting. For instance, an artist might have painted one scene, disliked what he'd come up with, and then overpainted it, and quite often using UV lighting we can reveal those original drawings beneath the finished paintings.
You're relied upon to unlock detail that otherwise couldn't be seen. There must have been a few things that, regardless of how well known the object is, there must have been a few times where you've been the first person to see something or spot something you've been photographing.
The conservators might come in and say, well, I've got an inkling that there's something going on here. And when we take the photographs, obviously digitally, it comes up in our computer screen and we were looking at something that hasn't been seen for hundreds of years.
It must be quite exciting.
It is. It's amazing. I think a couple of years ago, I can't remember the artist now, we were looking at a painting and it was a landscape, and when we put UV on it, it was actually a scene of a loch with a boat in it. So that was quite incredible. Everybody was flabbergasted that they'd actually overpainted something as beautiful as it looked. Even under UV, it was still an incredible scene.
You're getting closer to more of our objects than anybody else, I suppose.
Yeah, it's one of the small things that's actually always stuck with me throughout my career, that you go into the studio one day and the conservation people or technical staff will bring in a Charles Rennie Mackintosh watercolour. And we have access to that. We can move it about. We can touch these things. We're obviously wearing gloves, etc. You might one day be working with an Egyptian child's toy from 2,000 years ago, and to think that was carved for a child all that time ago, definitely sticks in your mind. Sometimes something comes into the studio and it's just breathtaking to think that that's a mammoth's tusk from X millions of years ago, or a dinosaur bone. Pieces like that are coming in every week. We're getting things like that coming into the studio, and it's just absolutely a fascinating aspect of our job.
So before we head into our final piece this week, let's look back over where we've been. We started off looking at the very nature of light itself with our conservators, swung by Burrell to work by candlelight, then hopped over to Nitshill to the Glasgow Museum's Resource Centre to meet with one of our photographers. To wrap up this week, we're heading into the city centre, find out what the first public building in Glasgow was to be fitted with electric light. April, do you want to have a guess about where it might have been?
I would guess one of the richer areas of Glasgow, so maybe down the Merchant City way, but I'm not sure.
Let's see if you're right.
Norrie, today we meet again. This time it's for our episode on light, and specifically what I'm interested to find out more about from you is when electric light came to Glasgow. Do we know what the first public building in Glasgow that had electric light was?
We do indeed, and it's very much, you mentioned the word arrival, and it was a place of arrival and departures. It was St Enoch Station in St Enoch Square in 1879. Previously, most large public buildings had been lit with gas, and in the huge cavernous space of somewhere like St Enoch Station, that wasn't going to be enough. So each of the railway companies was trying to outdo each other in terms of grandeur and modernity and all the rest of it. So when Glasgow was building St Enoch, well, what's the new kid in the block? It's electric light. And St Enoch Station, when it was built, originally had 6 huge electric lights illuminating the central concourse. I remember the central concourse as a small child when you still used to be able to park your car on it, and it was this huge semi-elliptical glass dome. I mean, it was almost cathedral-like, and I'm not actually quite sure if 6 big electric lights would have made that much of a difference to it. But of course it was an attraction. It's the first building in Glasgow to have electric light, so even if you weren't going to catch a train, you'd want to go in and visit to see the electric light. And after that, electric light took off. So the first building was St Enoch Station, the next building was the General Post Office in George Square.
Nora, do you have a sense of what the reaction was like from the public when they first saw those electric lights?
Certainly the press reaction was very favourable, because you've got to imagine in the Glasgow late 1800s, when you're talking a really pretty dark and polluted, sooty city, all of a sudden to have this bright, clear light that didn't hiss as gas mantles did, didn't let off that certain aroma. It was almost as if we'd captured lightning. Cooper & Co., which would eventually go on to become Cooper's Fine Fare, basically early supermarket, and they'd started life just at the back of St Enoch Station. They were the first commercial business in Glasgow to install electric lights in all their shops.
It must have been really shocking for people to experience that if they've never seen that before.
I think it would have been. And there was, just as there had been huge suspicions around gaslighting, it's going to burn your house down, there was huge suspicions around electric lighting for the fear that it might either electrocute you and kill you or burn your house or your premises down.
What kind of impact did it have on the city in terms of how people moved around or how they socialised?
It would certainly make the city much more illuminated. And what you've got to understand, people think now that late night shopping is a sort of modern invention. It's not. Even back in the late 1800s, people were going out shopping till 9 o'clock at night. A lot of the people were working a 12-hour day. You started work at 6 in the morning or 7 in the morning and you didn't finish until 6 or 7 at night. And you still had to get home and make your tea and get something for the tea.
Do you think initially that people would have thought that this was just for commercial or public buildings? Would they have imagined that it could have come into their own house?
Doubt it. It's a bit like today with electric cars. People have got to make the imaginative jump and the financial jump to say, right, this is the new technology. And it took a long time in Glasgow.
I'm just wondering what kind of impact it has on culture. For example, as people became more visible in the dark in terms of things like crime or nocturnal activities.
Glasgow was a city that worked by sunrise and sunset. You get up when the sun rose, no matter what time that was. So in the summer you'd be getting up at 4 or 5 in the morning. But you went to your bed as soon as the sun went down, A, because you didn't want to waste money in candles. Also, there wasn't a lot to do. Wealthy Glasgow gentlemen, if they were going out on the batter, usually to a private drinking club or their friend's house, they would hire what was called a torchère to lead them home, which was basically a big Highlander carrying a lit burning torch to walk in front of them. A, so that they could actually find their way home through the narrow streets, vennels and wynds of old Glasgow, but also as a bit of personal protection.
Going back to St Enoch itself, if you'd heard about it and you turned up for the first time, what would you see?
You would see a sort of semi-Gothic, great red sandstone cliff of a building, because it wasn't just a station, it was also a hotel. It was actually the largest hotel in Europe. It was the place where major city events took place. The Scottish Cup dinner was held there every year, and the winning team would come out on the balcony above the main door with the Scottish Cup. It's one of the great architectural losses of Glasgow.
Speaking of that flattening, and since we've got you here, can I ask, and it might be an urban myth, the stones from the building, was it used to reclaim part of the waterways like SECC?
Yep. Well, practically all the stonework from the St Enoch Hotel, it all ended up going in to fill in what was the Queen's Dock, where the hydro and the SECC were built.
Nora, I could speak to you all day. Thanks so much for speaking to us today.
My pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Curious City. Enormous thanks to April Hamilton for being our curious guest. You've joined us today to have a look at light. Next week, as promised, we're going to be having a look into the darkness and hearing some of this.
So today we're talking about the nocturnal habits of people in the past. It sounds a bit risky, doesn't it?
A little bit for this time of the morning.
I promise it's PG.
See you next time on Curious City.